Hi boys and girls. Today we're talking about adding and subtracting decimals. When we're adding and subtracting decimals, there is one rule and one rule only. And the rule is always line up your decimals. Always line up your decimals. Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals. Always line up your decimals. Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals.
Always line up your decimals. I hope you wrote that down. Always line up your decimals. The reason is because the decimal indicates place value. Everything after the decimal is less than a whole. It represents fractions. Everything greater than that decimal is a whole number. And so if we don't have that decimal in the right place, we aren't separating our whole number from our fractions correctly. And when we go to add and subtract them, things get totally messy. Here's an example of why you want to make sure that you have your decimals lined up. I've taken 13.2 and I've added it to 15.56. I added up my numbers, put them in columns according to this last number here. We would do that with whole numbers. We would make sure our ones line up, but since this is decimals, that changes things. So I have 13.2 plus 15.56, and you can see right off the bat how I have a decimal point here and I have a decimal point here. So I added up all my numbers, but then you can see I have no idea where to put my decimal. I could put my decimal here underneath this decimal point, or I could put it here underneath this decimal point, but neither one of those is actually correct. The correct way to add 13.2 plus 15.56 is to do this. Make sure the decimal points are all in a line, and then you add all the remaining numbers. Now when I have nothing here at all, I just treat that as if it's a 0. So this really would be 13.2, and you could even write a 0 if you wanted to. Remember how we talked about place value, and when there's nothing there, it means that there is 0 in that value right there. So 0 plus 6 is 6, 2 plus 5 is 7, there's my decimal point, 3 plus 5 is 8, and 1 plus 1 is 2. You can see how I get totally different answers by lining these up, and so it's really important that you line up those decimal points. So when you're subtracting, you're also going to do the same thing. You always write out the problem, making sure that your decimal points are completely lined up. And so I'm going to go ahead and actually give this problem to you as one of your practice problems. You're going to solve 15.16 minus 9.18. Make sure that you've lined it up exactly like I have. You have your decimal points in a line, and these numbers follow after. Your other practice problem is looking like this. 131.8 plus 872.4 plus 563.9. Please make sure that when you write out these problems, you always line up your decimals.